My brother left our family 12 years ago without a word. I learned the truth about why at the reading of my father's will when he walked in, and now I don't think my life will ever be the same. Growing up, my brother Ethan was my best friend. He was the kind of person everyone gravitated toward, charming, funny, and endlessly ambitious. As the older sibling, he always looked out for me. But everything changed when Ethan turned 22. Almost overnight, he became distant, angry, and withdrawn. By the time I was 18, Ethan was gone. He left without a goodbye, cutting off all contact with me, my parents, and anyone who knew him. For 12 years, there wasn't a single word. No calls, no letters, nothing. My parents were heartbroken, especially my dad. Ethan had always been Dad's golden child, the one he pinned all his dreams on. My dad tried everything to track him down, even hiring a private investigator, but it was like Ethan had vanished. Eventually, we stopped looking. Life moved on, though the void Ethan left behind was always there. Last month, my father passed away after a long battle with cancer. It was devastating, but not unexpected. My mom and I were left to handle the estate, including planning the funeral. That's when things got complicated. The lawyer handling my dad's will mentioned something strange. There's a clause that requires all family members to be present at the reading, he said. My mom and I exchanged confused looks. But it's just the two of us now, I said. The lawyer shook his head. No, your father listed Ethan as a beneficiary. He left specific instructions to contact him when the time came. Ethan? After 12 years of silence? Why would Dad include him in the will? Apparently, my father had been secretly writing letters to Ethan over the years, trying to mend things. He kept tabs on him but never told us because he didn't want to hurt us if Ethan rejected the olive branch. Per my dad's wishes, the lawyer had reached out to Ethan, and Ethan agreed to come. The day of the will reading, I walked into the lawyer's office with a mix of dread and anticipation. Would Ethan show up? What would he say? Did he even care? Then he walked in. He looked older, but he was still unmistakably Ethan. Same confident stride, same piercing eyes. But there was something different too. He seemed hardened. Like life hadn't been kind to him. We sat in tense silence until the lawyer began reading the will. My father had left a sizable inheritance, but there was a catch. Ethan's portion would only be released if he fulfilled one condition. He had to explain why he left. Ethan's face turned pale. For a moment, I thought he might leave again, but then he took a deep breath and started talking. I left because I found out I wasn't Dad's son, Ethan said, his voice trembling. The room went silent. My mom's face froze in shock, or maybe guilt. Ethan continued, explaining how he'd overheard a conversation between our mom and her sister. They were arguing, and our aunt blurted out that at least she wasn't trashy enough to cheat on the man that she married and allow him to raise a kid that's not really his. He confronted her later that night, and she confessed. She'd had an affair early in their marriage, and Ethan was the result. She begged him not to tell Dad. She said it would destroy the family. Ethan couldn't handle the lie. He couldn't look at Dad, who had raised him, loved him, and made so many sacrifices for him, without feeling like a fraud. So he left. He spent years trying to find his biological father, only to discover that the man wanted nothing to do with him. By the time Ethan thought about coming back, too much time had passed. Shame and anger kept him away. When Ethan finished, I turned to my mom. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. Is this true? I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. It was a mistake, one I've regretted every day since, but I never told your father because I loved him, and he loved Ethan like his own. Ethan looked at her, his jaw clenched. You let him love me under a lie. You let me leave, thinking he wouldn't love me if he knew the truth. My mom broke down sobbing, but Ethan didn't soften. You stole my relationship with him, he said coldly, and now he's gone. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My perfect family wasn't perfect at all. My dad had died without ever knowing the truth, and Ethan, my brother, had been carrying this burden alone for over a decade. But Ethan wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder and handed it to the lawyer. This is a DNA test, he said. Mom's still not telling the whole truth. Turns out, Ethan had taken a DNA test years ago and discovered that while my mom's affair was true, she'd been wrong about who his biological father was. The man she thought was Ethan's father wasn't a match. To this day, Ethan doesn't know who his biological father is. My mom sat in stunned silence, her sobs now quiet. Ethan stood up and walked to the door. I don't want the inheritance, he said. I didn't come for the money, I came for closure. And with that, he left. Now I'm left with questions I can't answer. Can we ever rebuild our family after so many lies? Should I try to reach out to Ethan or let him heal on his own? And most of all, How do I reconcile the image of the mother I thought I knew with who she turned out to be? What would you do if your family's biggest secret came out when it was too late to fix anything? Update. It's been 2 months since my brother Ethan walked out after the reading of Dad's will. I tried to focus on moving forward, but something gnawed at me. The idea that Ethan wasn't Dad's biological son, it just didn't sit right. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and the more I thought, the more I realized I needed answers. The thought that Ethan had carried so much pain and rejection because of something none of us could control kept me awake at night. If there was even a chance that the story Mom told was wrong, I had to know. So one night, fueled by anxiety and guilt, I ordered a DNA test kit. Not for Ethan, but for myself. A few weeks later, the results arrived. I opened the email expecting reassurance that nothing was out of the ordinary. But what I saw shook me to my core. There was no match to Dad's side of the family. I wasn't his son either. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. If I wasn't Dad's biological child, that meant Mom had lied to both of us, Ethan and me. The man who raised us, who we'd loved so deeply, had no idea that neither of us were his. It was like my entire identity had been pulled out from under me. After hours of staring at the results, I made a decision. I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed to tell Ethan. Maybe it would help him feel less alone, or maybe it would just add more chaos to an already broken family. Either way, he had to know. It took days to work up the courage to call him. When he answered, his voice was cold, distant. "What do you want?" he asked. "I need to see you," I said. "It's important." Reluctantly, he agreed to meet me at a park we used to play at as kids. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench with his arms crossed. The tension was palpable. "I took a DNA test," I blurted out, wasting no time. "Ethan, I'm not Dad's son either." His eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared at me, processing what I'd said. Then he laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "So she lied to both of us," he said, shaking his head. Un-effing believable. I told him everything. How I'd been feeling guilty since the will reading, how I needed answers, and how the results had shattered everything I thought I knew. For the first time in years, Ethan and I talked. Really talked. And for the first time, he didn't seem angry at me. "We've been living a lie," he said quietly. "Our whole lives." Ethan and I agreed that we needed to confront Mom together. She couldn't keep running from the truth, not after everything that had happened. So, we showed up at her house unannounced. When she opened the door and saw us standing there side by side, her face went pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need to talk," I said. We sat in the living room, and I wasted no time. "Mom, I took a DNA test. I'm not Dad's son either." Her face froze, her expression a mixture of shock and guilt. "What?" she whispered. "You heard me. Neither of us are Dad's kids. Ethan's known for years, but I just found out. I need answers." Her hands trembled as she clutched a tissue, and her eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted this to come out," she said softly. Ethan, barely able to contain his anger, cut in. "So what's the truth, Mom? Was Dad just some placeholder for you while you did whatever you wanted?" Her head snapped up, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, it wasn't like that. Your father, he was a good man, and I loved him, but I made mistakes." "Go on," I said, my voice cold. "Start with Ethan." She took a shaky breath. "Ethan, you were the result of an affair. I was lonely, and your dad was working long hours. It was a horrible, stupid mistake, but when I found out I was pregnant, I knew I couldn't tell him. He would have left me." "And me?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She shook her head. "It was the same man. We had stopped seeing each other, but that man just knew how to get to me. I swear that it only happened one more time. I convinced myself it didn't matter, because your dad loved you so much." He never questioned anything. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "So let me get this straight. You cheated with the same guy twice and just decided to roll the dice with everyone's lives?" "I made mistakes," she sobbed. "But I was scared. I didn't want to lose your father, and I didn't want you two to grow up without him. He was a good man, and he loved you both. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping it quiet." "The right thing?" Ethan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You let me think I was some kind of outsider. You let me believe I wasn't good enough, while all this time, you were the one lying." "I didn't mean for it to be like this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was protecting you both." I leaned back, trying to process everything. "So, you lied to Dad. You lied to us, and now he's gone, and we're left with this mess." She buried her face in her hands, unable to respond. The room was heavy with tension, and for a long moment no one spoke. Finally, Ethan stood up. "I'm done. You can cry all you want, but this doesn't fix anything." Mom sobbed harder, apologizing over and over, but Ethan wasn't having it. He stood up, pacing the room. "What's his name, and do you even know where he is?" She hesitated, then said his name is Richard, but she's not sure where he is now. Ethan walked out, slamming the door behind him. I stayed for a moment, staring at the woman I had called Mom all my life. She looked broken, but so was I. I don't think I can move forward from this, I said quietly. We deserve better than that. Dad deserved better than that, and you deserve to suffer alone for what you've done. I'm sorry, she whispered. For everything. I nodded, not because I forgave her, but because I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. Then I left. Ethan and I left Mom's house that night, feeling more lost than ever. But something had shifted between us. For the first time in years, we were brothers again. We were united in our anger, our confusion, and our determination to find the truth. We decided to track down the man Mom claimed was our biological father. It wasn't easy. He had moved several times and wasn't on social media. But eventually, we found him. He lived in a small town a few hours away. When we showed up at his door, he looked shocked to see us. But when we explained who we were, his face softened. I always wondered, he said quietly. Your mom? She told me you weren't mine. We spent hours talking to Richard, asking him questions, trying to piece together the story. He seemed genuine, even emotional, as he told us how he'd always hoped for a chance to know us. By the end of the night, I wasn't sure how to feel. I was angry at Mom for lying, but part of me was grateful to finally know the truth. Now, Ethan and I are trying to figure out what comes next. Do we let Richard into our lives? He was no angel in our eyes, because he was knowingly sleeping with a married woman? And how do we honor the memory of the man who raised us, who loved us? Will we ever be able to forgive our mother? The truth has brought us closer together, but it's also left us with more questions than answers. For now, all we can do is take it one step at a time. What would you do in our shoes?